The summer of 1944 in Normandy was an open wound. The sun, a relentless enemy, beat down on Captain Frank Tex Dillon, but it was the silence that truly withered the soul. The silence that followed the snap of a bullet, the final, absolute quiet that indicated another man was gone. Dillon stood beside a shallow, muddy ditch, one of the thousands of natural fortifications known as the bocage. These low earthen walls, thick with centuries of root systems and crowned with dense thorn bushes, defined this sector of the American advance. They were not merely obstacles, they were a labyrinth designed for ambush. Every few yards, a turn, a low spot, or an overgrown bank offered the perfect, unseen killing ground. He stared at a stretcher draped hastily in a poncho, a silhouette that now represented Private First Class Harper, a forward observer Dillon had personally approved 3 days earlier. Harper had been a good man, steady and sharp. Now he was a casualty, the 10th in just 5 days attempting to scout the choke point near Saint-Lô. "They didn't even hear the shot, Captain," whispered Sergeant Miller, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting restlessly toward the ridge. Miller's fatigue wasn't just physical. It was the psychological exhaustion of being hunted by ghosts. Just a faint crack, maybe a half-mile away. Clean through the helmet. Didn't even disturb the leaf he was looking at. Before this story goes any further, if you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, remember this. Men like Harper didn't get a second chance. Their stories are forgotten every day. Don't be the person who lets their sacrifice fade into silence. Subscribe now, so their names don't die twice. The hedgerows were not a battlefield. They were a meat grinder. The American advance had stalled, choked by an enemy they rarely saw. The German sniper corps, masters of camouflage, patience, and the ruthless exploitation of terrain. Dillon's troops were bleeding out, Choked by an unseen hand, paralyzed by the fear that the next step, the next breath, might be their last. The casualty rate here had dwarfed the losses suffered in the initial beach landings, defined not by grand assaults, but by surgical, individual terminations. The worst of these invisible foes held a particular ridge, a crest of high ground near the village of Saint-Lô. This point, dominated by the skeletal, fire-scorched remains of a destroyed farmhouse, was a geographical funnel. Any attempt to cross the intervening 300 yards of relatively open ground, necessary to move tanks and artillery observers, ended with agonizing predictability. The German shooters had established interlocking fields of fire, making the area a death trap that had cost the lives of 3 forward observers, 2 radio men, vital links of communication, and countless infantry attempting to cross. Dillon slammed his fist onto the topographical map spread across his Jeep hood, the paper protesting with a sharp crinkle. He traced the contour lines of the ridge, which seemed to mock him with their deceptive simplicity. The enemy was too many, too skilled, and, most fatally, too arrogant in their success. "It's their arrogance that kills us," Dillon muttered to Miller. "They know we have the firepower to flatten that ridge, but they also know we can't risk the collateral. They are masters of patience. They wait for us to break doctrine, to make a move, to expose ourselves." Every attempted counter-sniper action had been a disaster. Dillon had sent out his best men, equipped with the powerful 1903 Springfield rifles and high-power scopes. The result was always the same. Another dead GI, the opposing shooter often hit by 2 or 3 quick, precise rounds before the first man even fell. The Germans were adapting faster than the Americans. They knew the range, the sound, and the capabilities of the Allied snipers. "We need to clear that ridge." "And we need a damn miracle," Dillon spat, wiping sweat and frustration from his brow. "The conventional approach is not just suicide, it's a gift to those bastards." Into this stifling atmosphere of despair and systemic failure walked Sergeant Chet Davies. Chet was an anomaly, a quiet man who seemed to view the chaos of war with a peculiar detached intensity. He was not built like a frontline infantryman. He moved with the economical precision of a man who measured every step. His eyes held a blend of a watchmaker's need for exactitude and deep, unsettling contemplation. While the other designated snipers meticulously cleaned their powerful M1903 Springfields, carefully oiling the bolt mechanisms and checking the heavy-caliber ammunition, Chet was tinkering with a peculiar weapon. It was a diminutive M2 carbine. It was lighter, shorter, and chambered a relatively weak .30 caliber cartridge, initially designed for rear echelon troops and drivers. Compared to the big, heavy rifles, the M2 looked like a toy. Private Earl Jensen, a thick-necked sniper whose confidence rested solely on the size and scope of his bolt action, stood over Chet, a heavy look of contempt on his face. "That thing fires glorified pistol rounds, Davies," Jensen scoffed, shaking his head. "You gonna tickle those krauts to death? The 1903 can drop a man from 800 yards. That thing can barely bust a bottle from 100. The air crackled with the silent judgment of the entire company. Military doctrine demanded the biggest gun with the longest reach. Chet's choice was an offense to their survival instincts. Chet looked up slowly, not at Jensen but toward the ridge. He smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his intense gaze. "They are patient, Earl. Too patient. And they are proud. They believe the only threat comes from a loud, long-distance gun they already know how to counter." He picked up the M2 carbine. "That," Chet tapped the small carbine, the light, distinct clack a perfect contrast to the heavy brass of the M1903 rounds scattered on his poncho, "is the key to their arrogance. It doesn't sound like a threat. It sounds like a mistake." Chet approached Dillon, not with a request for heavier arms or more spotters, but with a plan that was offensively simple and dangerously audacious. He laid his small carbine next to the topographical map, the rifle looking utterly out of place amidst the serious instruments of war. "Captain," Chet began, his voice low but firm, "the plan is a deception. They are hunting the 1903 sound. We have to give them something else." He detailed his needs. "I need a 3-man team, me, Corporal Jack Olson to operate the real weapon, and 1 decoy. And this." He tapped the M2. "I will use this to draw their fire, Captain. I will make them believe I am an amateur who has panicked." Dillon stared, running a hand across his grim, unshaven jaw. He needed a break, any break. Against every military text and drill he had ever known, Dillon saw a glimmer of unconventional sense in the quiet man's detailed plan. Chet was proposing to turn a weakness, the light caliber of the M2, into a weapon of psychological warfare. "Davies," Dillon finally said, his voice flat with desperation, "you better be the smartest damn man in this theater, because what you are proposing is insubordination under normal circumstances. This will not be normal circumstances." Dillon reluctantly signed off, his signature heavy on the requisition papers. The mission was set. But before Chet could even begin to zero the strange little rifle, an order, stamped with the highest authority, came down the line. The obstacle wasn't the German snipers anymore. It was the rigid doctrine of the American command, enforced by General Patton himself. Sergeant Chet Davies was meticulously zeroing the borrowed 1903 rifle, the one Corporal Olson would operate, when the noise started. It wasn't the sound of battle, but the grinding, unwelcome noise of a jeep pulling up too fast, followed by the crisp snap of an aide's salute. An order had arrived. If you're still watching without subscribing, ask yourself something honestly. Men on this field followed orders that could kill them. All you're asked to do is tap one button. Don't leave this channel standing alone while we keep their history alive. Subscribe. Don't walk past their memory like it doesn't matter. It was issued from the highest echelons, a field memo from General George S. Patton himself. The general, known for his rigorous adherence to offensive doctrine, had recently decried the use of anything he deemed insufficient for long-range, frontline engagements. The .30 caliber carbine, the M2, was specifically on the list of discouraged firearms, deemed insufficient for the professional work of stopping a man at distance. Chet read the memo's summarized language. It didn't forbid the rifle. It simply discouraged it through official censure and implied consequence. Patton's reasoning was simple. A soldier must have confidence in his weapon, and his weapon must have the power to stop the enemy cold. The M2 carbine, by doctrine, failed on both counts. "It's not just regulation, Davies," Captain Dillon explained, his face a roadmap of worry lines. "It's the general's philosophy. He wants impact. He wants authority. He doesn't want toys near the front." The order, while concerning, might have been manageable had it not brought its own enforcer. A thick-set man in freshly pressed khakis stepped out of the jeep, brushing dust from his shoulders as if it were an insult. Major Walter Haynes, a staff officer known less for his battlefield experience and more for his rigid adherence to protocol,
arrived, citing the memo as if it were sacred scripture. Major Haynes did not address Chet directly. He addressed Dillon. "Captain, I understand you authorized a counter-sniper action utilizing what appears to be a lightweight support weapon. I am here to terminate that authorization." Dillon stood his ground, pointing toward the ridge. "Major, the casualties are too high. We've lost 11 men in 7 days. Our conventional methods are failing." Haynes's gaze, cold and uncompromising, finally landed on Chet and the diminutive carbine lying beside the powerful bolt-action rifle. "Davies," the major began, his voice laced with professional contempt, "that toy of yours is going to get you killed, and it will jeopardize this entire sector. You will take the 1903 or you will stand down. This is an order enforced by the authority of the General's field memo." Chet, the quietest man on the perimeter, had suddenly found his biggest conflict was not the Germans waiting patiently 300 yards away, but the officer standing 3 feet in front of him. The official systemic enemy was far more immediate than the invisible one. Chet stood slowly, never raising his voice, but every word carried the weight of the 11 men lost. "Sir," Chet said, gesturing first toward the German ridge, then toward the bolt-action rifle. "The 1903 makes a specific sound, a heavy, unmistakable report. The high-power cartridge requires a specific range and generates a specific flash. They know that sound. They expect that sound." He picked up the M2 carbine, holding it lightly. "If they hear the 1903, they will remain silent. They will stay hidden, because they know a professional is hunting them. We go back to square one." Chet stepped closer to the major, compelling the officer to look at the carbine. "This whole mission hinges on them thinking I am not a threat." On them believing they have found an easy target, a panicked grunt with a range toy. Chet explained his psychological premise. The German snipers were masters of patience, but their success had bred arrogance. Their downfall would be impatience, a desire to eliminate a non-threat quickly and confidently. The sound of the Millen II, a lighter, faster, higher-pitched crack, would signal exactly that non-threat. It would invite a moment of exposure. Dillon stepped in, his eyes locked on Haynes. "Major, we have exhausted our options. The casualties are too high. We need a break. Let him try his trick." Dillon was risking his own career on Chet's audacity, a gamble based purely on desperation. Haynes hesitated, his career instincts battling his awareness of the grim reality of the hedgerows. He finally capitulated, but his face was set hard. "Very well, Sergeant Davies," Haynes stated, the concession tasting like ash. "You have my authorization to proceed.
But the moment you cross that ditch, you answer to the general's order. If you fail, you will answer for violating that order. The warning was clear. Success was the only justification for breaking doctrine. The subsequent paperwork was carefully tailored. The official papers detailing the mission, the papers that would be read by staff officers hundreds of miles from the mud and the killing, would simply list Sergeant Davies as carrying the standard-issue $1,000,000 Garand, the regulation battle rifle. The use of the $1,002 carbine, the toy rifle, was now a closely guarded secret, a deliberate, calculated deception within a deception. Chet and Corporal Olson packed their gear. The heavy, suppressed 1903 rifle hidden deep in a canvas wrap, and the small, exposed $1,002 carbine, its presence broadcasting a false sense of security. They moved out under the cover of a dense, moonless night. Chet, the quiet man, carried not just a rifle, but a secret that could either save 100 men or court-martial him before a firing squad. He was deliberately going to sound like the very definition of incompetence, to lure the masters of precision into making their one fatal mistake. Sergeant Chet Davies and Corporal Jack Olson took up position 2 hours before the first hint of false dawn. They were tucked deep into a dense, overgrown cluster of oak roots, approximately 300 yards from the main German-held ridge. For the first 2 days, Chet did nothing but observe. He used his binoculars, scanning every shadow, every broken branch, and every slight shift in the foliage of the ridge. He didn't look for the men. He looked for the environment that allowed the men to disappear. Olson, the spotter, meticulously charted the subtle movements of the sun, wind patterns, and the precise, overlapping kill zones the snipers had established. The silence was the real enemy, a psychological weapon that froze the American advance. Chet spent hours reviewing his theory. The Germans had grown complacent, secure in their technical superiority and the predictable responses of the Allied forces. They expected the long-range chess match of 2 professionals. He was not going to give them a chess match. He was going to give them a temper tantrum. He prepared the weapons. The 1903 rifle, the true instrument of death, was zeroed perfectly and wrapped in burlap, its suppressor adding length, but crucially muffling the heavy report to a manageable thwump. It was hidden 20 yards away from their primary observation post, operated by Olson. Chet himself kept the mid-$2 carbine exposed, a light, short weapon that, to any distant observer, screamed amateur. He loaded it with the standard full-metal jacket rounds. They didn't need range, they needed sound. On the 3rd morning, the trick began. The sun was barely above the trees when Chet broke the silence. He didn't aim. He didn't even try to locate a target. He simply flipped the M2 to semi-automatic and fired a short, rapid burst, 3 quick rounds, into the brush line, deliberately 100 yards short of the known enemy positions. The sound was distinct, a less powerful, higher-pitched crack, 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 a frantic, almost panicked report that lacked the thunderous authority of the bolt-action rifles. It sounded less like a sniper marking a target, and more like a nervous green infantryman accidentally spraying fire in the wrong direction. Chet waited. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his breathing remained shallow and slow. He had just voluntarily announced his presence as a non-threat. If the Germans were patient, they would ignore it. If they were arrogant, they would investigate. After a long minute, which felt like 10, the tension broke. A slight flicker of movement, not in the most obvious sniper nest, but further down the ridge, near a cluster of burned timber. The movement suggested not a hunter preparing a patient shot, but a man adjusting for a clear, easy sight picture. Arrogance and impatience were Chet's allies. The German sniper, frustrated by the stalled advance and believing he had an easy, panicked target with a lightweight weapon, broke cover slightly to acquire the source of the foolish firing. It was a fraction of a second, all the time Chet needed. He hadn't fired the initial burst to hit anyone. He had fired it to provoke the enemy into a hasty, prideful mistake. Chet gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward Olson, who was peering through the powerful scope of the hidden M1903 rifle. A moment later, the low thwump of the suppressed bolt-action rifle cracked once from the thicket 20 yards away. The enemy sniper dropped, his movement suddenly, violently interrupted. The German never heard the shot that killed him. He had been so focused on the sound of the M2 carbine, the sound of weakness, that he had completely failed to account for a separate, silent threat. Chet recorded the kill in his mind, but gave no outward sign of triumph. The trick had worked. Throughout the rest of the day, Chet repeated the sequence. He would fire short bursts, sometimes 2 rounds, sometimes 4, varying the pattern to reinforce the illusion of a scattered amateur presence. The Germans, thinking they were facing a panicked amateur with a lightweight weapon, began to move and engage with less caution, eager to eliminate the easily located annoyance. They wanted the kill, and Chet was handing them the invitation. Olsen, utilizing the precision of the heavy-caliber rifle, would eliminate the provoked target. By nightfall, they had taken down 8 snipers. The impact was immediate. The entire mood of the front had shifted. The crossing was no longer a death trap. Infantry patrols managed to probe forward 50 yards further than they had in a week. Captain Dillon, though still grim, carried a new, cautious hope. Chet's unconventional logic had delivered the miracle they needed. But the German command structure was not stupid. They were masters of observation themselves, and 8 lost men in one day, all killed immediately after a distinct, weak-sounding burst of fire, signaled a pattern. They adapted. They realized they were facing not an amateur, but a calculated, deliberate trap designed to exploit their haste. Overnight, the German tactics changed. They began to use a new, brutal countermeasure. Double taps, sometimes even triple taps. If one sniper spotted Chet's position, a second one, further back and shielded, would immediately take the shot the moment the first man moved, leaving no time for Olsen to acquire them. They were betting that the spotter and the decoy were in the same location. They were hunting the suppressed M1903. On the morning of the 4th day, the air felt charged, thick with the silence of knowledge. The Germans knew the trick, but Chet knew they knew the trick. The next action would decide everything. Chet instructed Corporal Olsen to remain hidden, emphasizing that the M1903 was not to fire unless Chet was absolutely dead or captured. The enemy was now hunting Olsen's location. He could not risk the telltale sound or flash. Chet went out alone, taking only the M2 carbine and a small backpack. He moved to an observation post 50 yards away from Olsen's hidden position, making sure there was thick, visual cover between them. He fired his M2 carbine, a quick burst of 3 rounds. Immediately, the German response was devastating and disciplined. 3 bullets, not one, tore through the air where Olsen would have been had he been with Chet. The rounds chewed through the undergrowth, kicking up clods of dirt and splintered wood. If your heart jumped just now, if you felt even a fraction of what those men lived through, then you already know this history deserves better than viewers who watch silently and disappear. Don't be that person. Subscribe so the effort to tell these forgotten stories isn't wasted. The enemy was coordinating the fire, aiming for the spot where the weak-sounding rifle and the powerful, suppressed one were expected to converge. Chet ducked low, the dirt raining down around him, the acrid smell of burnt powder stinging his nostrils. He was now alone, exposed, having successfully drawn the enemy's coordinated, retaliatory fire upon himself. He had anticipated the double tap. He had invited the triple tap. His final, most dangerous ploy required him to use the M2 carbine not just as a decoy, but as a primary weapon, closing the distance to make its smaller caliber lethal. The true deception had just begun. Chet lay pressed into the mud, the echo of the 3 German rounds ringing in his ears. He had successfully drawn the coordinated fire, confirming the enemy's new operating assumption. The weak-sounding rifle and the powerful suppressed one were working in tandem from the same general area. They were certain they had just neutralized the primary threat. He checked the $2 carbine. It was light, handy, and fast. The small caliber was its weakness at long distance, but its semi-automatic rate of fire was its undisputed strength in a close-quarters situation. He had to close the distance from 300 yards to less than 100 to make the weapon lethal, reliable, and decisive. Chet had anticipated the double tap. This was his final, most dangerous ploy, one that relied entirely on the German snipers' professional need for confirmation and their persistent belief that the M2 user was already neutralized. He positioned his helmet on a stick, covering the base with earth and a scattering of fresh leaves, making the illusion of a prone, dead soldier believable from a distance. The helmet was riddled with the new triple tap holes, completing the lie. Using the noise of a distant American artillery barrage as cover, Chet began to flank. He didn't take the direct route. Instead, he plunged into a muddy, overgrown irrigation ditch that snaked parallel to the ridge. It was a miserable route. Cold, fetid water soaked his fatigues, and every movement risked scraping against a hidden piece of wire or stone, creating a noise that could betray him. He crawled through the ditch for nearly 100 yards, putting the main force of the German perimeter behind him. When he finally emerged, he was far to the flank, slightly behind the expected position of the main German sniper nests. He was now less than 100 yards from the farmhouse, near the enemy's blind spot. He fired a short burst of 4 quick rounds from the $2 at the empty, damaged helmet 100 yards back. The sound was distinct and final. The reaction was immediate. Believing the target was attempting a final,
Desperate suppression fire before succumbing to his wounds, 2 German snipers, the 2 remaining men controlling the main choke point, cautiously moved from their perches. They weren't moving to shoot. They were moving to confirm the kill and, crucially, to claim the American rifle as a trophy. Their arrogance demanded a final, confirming peek. As the 2 snipers exposed themselves, one emerging from the upper window of the ruined farmhouse, the other rising from behind a heavily camouflaged tree root, Chet acted. He wasn't using the M2 as a trick anymore. He was using its superior mechanical advantage. The small carbine was already shouldered and sighted. Unlike the slow, deliberate action required to cycle the bolt on the M1903 rifle, the M2 allowed Chet to fire as fast as he could pull the trigger. The minimal recoil of the smaller cartridge meant he could keep the sight picture on target, even during the rapid bursts. 2 quick, successive rounds from the M2 found the first sniper as he leaned out the farmhouse window. The man slumped and vanished. The speed was the key. The German never had time to register that the fire was coming from a totally unexpected direction. The second German, shocked by the sudden close-range attack from his flank, raised his bolt-action rifle, its heavy action already open, preparing for the slow cycle of ammunition. He was a professional, but his training was for distance, not for this frantic, close-in duel. The small carbine was already cycling. Chet delivered a controlled 3-round burst. The German was dead before he could aim the rifle. The engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. The 4th day ended not with a desperate retreat, but with 3 more snipers eliminated, bringing the total to 11. The ridge was clear. If you made it to this moment and still haven't subscribed, think about this. Chet risked everything for the men beside him. All you're risking is a single click. Don't let this channel keep carrying the weight alone. Subscribe now. Honor the men who never hesitated when everything was on the line. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of emptiness, not the silence of ambush. Chet signaled Olsen, who emerged, pale but relieved. They retrieved the 3 American casualties, the dead snipers. The U.S. troops crossed the field unmolested an hour later. Supply trucks rumbled through the choke point, and artillery observers finally reached their vantage points. The breakthrough at Saint-Lô, though slow and costly, could now accelerate.
The official report, written by Captain Dillon and passed through a reluctant Major Haynes, mentioned Sergeant Davies' incredible marksmanship with a standard-issue rifle. It praised his audacity and precision. It did not mention the double-earned $2 carbine, the toy rifle, or the fact that a direct order from General Patton had been cleverly circumvented. The truth of the matter, the deception, the insubordination, and the revolutionary tactic was now a secret shared by only a handful of men. The moral question lingered, a quiet echo in the aftermath. Did Sergeant Davies violate a direct order to save his men, or did he prove that in warfare, rigid doctrine can be more dangerous than the enemy? Chet had risked court-martial and disgrace, not for personal glory, but for tactical necessity. The small carbine was cleaned and placed back in its case, its barrel still faintly warm. It faded into history, largely overshadowed by the bigger, louder weapons, the M1 Garand and the M193 machine gun. But its revolutionary design didn't die. The Germans, meticulous record-keepers even in defeat, learned a dangerous lesson from their own mistakes in the hedgerows that day. They observed the efficiency of the Americans' light, fast-firing intermediate rounds, the very concept embodied by the double-earned $2 carbine. They saw how a light,
Controllable weapon could dominate a close-quarters battle, allowing rapid, repeated, accurate fire. And that very lesson, the power of lightweight, fast-firing intermediate cartridges, would be used to inspire a terrifying new weapon, the assault rifle, a weapon that would define the next half-century of conflict, proving Chet Davies' unconventional theory correct long after the Normandy mud had dried.